Hi, and welcome to this mini course on how to crush the Scholar's Mate in early queen attacks. This course is recommended for novices to early intermediate, or between 300 and 800 ELO. The way I structure this course is that the student will learn about the key ideas of each variation, and we progress from variation to variation in a logical way that builds off of previous variations and White's responses. Along the way, I will show you proper defense tactics and the important concept of tempo, which is very important for beginners and intermediates alike. So without further ado, let's begin with a review of Scholar's Mate. So Scholar's Mate begins with e4, e5, and then queen h5. This is known as the wayward queen attack. The queen is very ambitious and wishes to attack her pawn on e5 immediately. The issue with moving the queen early in the opening is that the queen is the most valuable piece on the board, and it will quickly become a target. Better moves are developing the knights and the bishops to the center, like knight f3. Knight c6 is the most principled response to queen h5. Before we attack the queen, we must defend our pawn on e5 first. For example, after g6, this over-ambitious move falls to queen takes e5 check, forking the king and the rook. After something like bishop e7, we just take the rook, and white is up a full rook and is winning. Knight f6 just hangs the pawn on e5. After queen takes e5 check, white is slightly better because he's up a pawn. The queen can eventually escape by rerouting itself to d4 and then e3. Queen e7 is too passive. It allows white to immediately equalize with bishop c4. And black is lower on development because the bishop on f8 is trapped by the queen. It cannot develop. d6 is an okay move, but it's still a bit too passive because after something like bishop c4, I think that white still has this threat, and compared to knight c6, the knight isn't developed. You only push this pawn, which also blocks the bishop. So this is why I prefer knight c6 instead of d6. Queen f6 is a very interesting move. Black has some ideas of his own to attack white's f2 square, but we have the move knight c3 with the goal of gaining tempo on the queen. For example, after bishop c5, knight to f3, defending the f2 square, d6, and knight d5. White's centralized knight is better, and the queen is forced back to d8, so white is just better in this position. So after knight c6, bishop c4 attacks the weak f7 pawn, which is generally the weakest square in the opening in addition to f2. White prepares to deliver a checkmate on f7 with the queen. Knight f6 is a horrible blunder because white has the checkmate queen takes f7. In general, you should always look for your opponent's threats before making threats of your own in the opening, especially if you're a beginner. If you fail to do so, you might fall victim to quick checkmates like this one. Next, we'll look at black's responses to the Scholar's Mate. After e4, e5, queen h5, we already established that knight c6 is the best response, because other moves like g6 and knight to f6 allow white to gain material. So after knight c6, bishop to c4 is the most logical move. It attacks the f7 pawn. We have this very critical move, g6. It's the only move that works because the queen's diagonal on the f7 pawn is now blocked, and the queen cannot take on e5, because queen takes e5 is a horrible blunder because we just win the queen. So the queen must go back to f3. And this is the only logical move because it maintains the checkmate threat on f7. So we have this move, knight f6. It's a very multi-purpose move because we develop a knight, and again we neutralize the checkmate threat on f7 because the queen's attack is blocked by the knight. It also develops a knight into the center, which is very good in the opening. Queen to b3 is a over-ambitious move. It's also a popular move I see in beginner games, because white is setting up this powerful battery on the f7 pawn. So how do we defend this pawn now? One thing I notice is that the queen moving here allows this knight move, because queen here is a weakness. After we get our knight here, we can create these two threats of attacking the queen and attacking the pawn on c2. So this is exactly what we'll do. White has spent the last two moves moving his queen and wasting precious tempo, which is time, and we can use this lost time to attack the queen and threaten fork on c2, forcing white to lose more tempo. After something like bishop takes f7 check, we just move our king up because this is the only move. Now it is white who has to deal with these two threats. So after queen to c4, trying to defend both the c2 pawn and the bishop on f7, we have this very nice move, b5. Again, we gain a tempo on the queen. The queen is unable to defend both squares at the same time. For example, after queen to c5 check, we have bishop takes f7, and the queen will have trouble defending the square because we have this discovered attack on the queen. Queen to d3 just allows us to take the bishop, so black is just winning. We established last chapter that queen to c4 does not work, so the engine says that the best move in this position for white is actually queen to d3, just giving up the bishop. In reality, white cannot defend both pieces at the same time, so we just take the bishop. The next variation we'll look at is d3. So after knight to f6, instead of going queen to b3, a better move is actually d3. So this is another very popular move. However, it is weaker than the other move, which is c3, which we'll discuss in the next chapter. So after d3, again, we have this very powerful knight outpost on d4 that our knight can go to. And because d3, unlike c3, does not protect the square, we immediately land our knight on d4, gaining tempo on the queen again and forcing her back to d1 to protect the c2 square from the powerful knight fork. So after queen goes to d1, we notice how the queen moved from d1 to h5 on the second move, then back to f3, and finally back to d1. All of these moves are lost tempos that can be spent on solid developing moves. And we must take advantage of this lost tempo with d5, striking immediately at the center. After something like e takes d5, we have the move b5, getting tempo on the bishop again. Some may wonder why you can't take with the bishop, but after knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes, black is just winning in this position because white has no development, and black's queen has this powerful attack on the diagonal. So after e takes and b5, the computer likes this move a lot because instead of taking right away, for example, if we take right away, after c3, our knight on d4 has to go back. And now white has gained a tempo on our knight, so we must spend some time moving our knight back. And in this position, white has just equalized. So instead, we play b5, attacking the bishop. The bishop has to move to a square like b3. And after a5, we're threatening to trap the bishop with pushing the pawn to a4. White must now respond to this threat with something like c3. Right now, we just take the bishop, because overall this trade just benefits us. We have the bishop pair now. After queen takes, we take the pawn with our queen now. For example, after something like queen takes, knight takes, c4 is very aggressive and fails because of knight to b4. Again, we take advantage of the weakness on the c2 square. Additionally, this pawn here is also very weak, so now we're threatening two different things. Something like knight a3 doesn't work because knight takes d3, check, just wins this pawn, and white's king has to move. I think in this position, black is just winning. White has no counterplay. Next, we'll look at c3. We mentioned last chapter that d3 allows the knight to come in with knight d4, so c3 is one of White's most popular moves. According to the Lichess database, it prevents any knight d4 intrusions and prepares d3 on the next move. Right here, we play bishop to g7. We fianchetto the bishop on g7. It's a good defender of the knight on f6, and eventually may stare down the long diagonal. d3 is the most principled and popular move. The dark square bishop's diagonal is now opened. White may have some ideas of going bishop g5 and pinning the knight to our queen. On the next move, we just move the king to safety with castles. After bishop g5, we have this interesting move, knight a5. It's not a very popular move, however, let's attack the powerful bishop and win the bishop pair. Play deviates after this move. For example, after bishop to b5, we just chase the bishop away with c6, b5. The bishop has to go back to c2 if White does not want his bishop to get captured. After d5, we strike at the center. Notice all these pawns in the center. Black just has a lot more development than White. White's queen is still misplaced. Our king is safe and castled. White's king is still in the center, and on e1, the knight can't really develop to f3, where White wants it to develop to, so Black is just better in this position. After something like bishop to b3, continuing to stare down this long diagonal and putting pressure on the f7 pawn, we can take the bishop with knight takes b3. Overall, this trade benefits Black because the bishop was very powerful and the knight wasn't doing much on a5. After knight to d2, we just take the bishop again. We can push d6 to defend the pawn adequately, and Black is better in this position. After knight to f6, there's also the move knight to e2. This is the computer's top move, and the third most popular move according to the database. White logically develops the knight, which controls d4, and prevents any knight d4 intrusions. White can also castle on the next move. The only downside I can think of is that the queen is blocked from getting to e2 or d1, but overall this is the best move, according to the engine. Again, similar to the c3 chapter, we just develop our bishop and fianchetto it on g7. After something like d3, with similar ideas of developing the bishop and pinning the knight to our queen, we just castle. If White plays something like castles, we also castle, and I think Black is slightly better in this position because the queen on f3 is misplaced. Black should develop naturally and get his other bishop out with like d6, bishop to e6, or bishop to g4. So after d3 castles, bishop g5 is the most popular move, trying to pin our knight to the queen. After d6, I think Black's position is solid and easy to play. His plan should just be to develop his bishop, push h6 right here, and kick White's g5 bishop away, and maybe create some threats of his own with like knight to a5, knight to b4, threatening the c2 pawn. Next, we'll talk about a interesting opening called the Napoleon attack, which is queen to f3. It's been played by Napoleon Bonaparte himself. Unfortunately, it's rather weak and can easily be refuted. White's idea is similar to that of the scholar's mate. He targets the pawn on f7 and hopes to bring his bishop to c4 and give checkmate. Right here, we just play knight to f6 because one can even argue that it is weaker than the wayward queen attack because White does not attack the pawn on e5. So we can immediately start defending with multi-purpose developing moves like knight f6. After something like bishop to c4, we have this very interesting move and good move, which is c6. It's a very important move to remember, and it's better than the more popular move, knight c6, because we prepare to blow up the center with d5 on the next move. So after c6, it prepares d5, because the d5 square is now protected by the pawn on c6. d3 is one popular move by White, although it's not as accurate as c3, knight to c3, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. After d3, we strike at the center with d5. because that was our plan all along. We want to push d5 and gain tempo on the bishop. After e takes d5, c takes d5, the bishop has to move. If the bishop moves to b3, for example, we just develop the knight to c6, and black is close to winning in this position because of his big center. He should develop his bishops, castle, and maybe even create some threats of his own with his queen and his knight. For example, queen to a5 check, knight to d4, forking the queen and the bishop, bishop to e6, bishop to e7, castling. It's quite simple, and black is just very safe here. Again, we talked about the alternative, which is knight to c3. It's more accurate than d3. But after b5, we again gain tempo on the bishop, because c6 both protects the d5 square and the b5 square. So the bishop has to move. And for example, after bishop to b3, we can keep pushing the pawns, like a5. And black is threatening to trap white's pieces if the white player is not careful. After something like a3, giving the bishop some breathing room, we can just develop our bishop to c5. We're preparing to castle on the next move and push d6. After something like knight g e2, we just push d6, and our plan is very simple. Black should castle and then develop his other bishop, and maybe even push the a5 pawn to gain more space. Compared with white, his pieces are much more active, and white will have trouble reactivating his bishop and the c3 knight. After bishop to c5, instead of knight g e2, there's also the immediate d3. After d3, we play d6. The ideas for black's position are very similar to that of the knight g e2 variation. Black wants to castle and then develop his c8 bishop to a square like g4 or e6, and maybe pushes a5 pawn to a4 to gain more space. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you're interested in checking out this course, the Lichess study should be in the description below. If you liked this video, feel free to give it a like or subscribe. I might release some more videos in the future. Again, thank you for watching.